The millionaire CEO was sipping whiskey alone, until he spotted two birthday boys in paper hats, sitting without a cake, or a parent, in sight. Jason Carter didn't believe in fate. He believed in numbers, strategy, and discipline, principles that had taken him from a forgotten childhood to the sleek corner office of one of the most powerful investment firms in the country. That evening, he had no intention of making any decisions beyond whether he'd order a second glass of whiskey. He entered the quiet bar on the edge of the city out of habit more than desire, a place he'd once frequented before the world started recognizing his name. It was quiet inside, dim but warm, with the kind of low jazz that filled the silence without intruding. He took his usual seat near the window, away from the bar, and signaled for a Macallan, neat. It was supposed to be an uneventful moment of stillness at the end of another day crammed with meetings and managed expectations. He leaned back in the leather chair, loosened his tie slightly, and exhaled. The amber liquid glinted in the low light as he lifted the glass to his lips. He hadn't even looked around the room yet. But when he did, his eyes paused at a small table in the far corner of the bar, where two boys sat side by side. They were around 6 years old, maybe younger, their blonde curls messy from the wind, both wearing oversized paper birthday hats that slouched slightly to the side. In front of them sat two sad cupcakes, candles already melted and untouched, and a single gift bag resting between them like a silent witness. There were no balloons. No friends. No parents. Just the boys, quietly sitting there as if waiting for someone who hadn't shown up. Jason frowned, setting his glass down. Something about the image twisted in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. The boys weren't crying. In fact, they weren't speaking at all. They just stared at their table with an eerie stillness, one that didn't belong on faces so young. It took him a moment to realize what was missing: joy. There wasn't even a hint of it in their expressions. He called the bartender over and asked who they were. The man, polishing a glass behind the counter, sighed. They come here every year. Their mom used to bring them for their birthday. This is the first year she didn't show up. Word is she's in a coma. Car accident. They came anyway. Said they had to keep the tradition. Brought their own cupcakes. Jason blinked slowly, the words settling into him like cold water. He turned back toward them. They hadn't moved. Their backs were straight, hands folded in their laps. They looked too proper, too practiced, like they were doing their best to be good, because they had no idea what else to do. Without thinking, Jason stood and crossed the room, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. He stopped just beside their table and crouched so he was at their level. "Hey there," he said gently. "Happy birthday." Both boys looked up at once, their eyes wide and round, one pair golden brown, the other nearly identical. One of them, the boy on the left, nodded politely. "Thank you, sir." "I'm Jason," he said. "Do you mind if I sit with you for a bit?" The second boy glanced at his brother, then back at Jason, and nodded slowly. Jason took the empty seat. The table was sticky from the frosting, and the candles had burned low and curved into the icing. The sight of it made Jason's throat tighten. "I'm Cody," said the first boy. "He's Cameron." "Nice to meet you, Cody and Cameron," Jason said, managing a smile. "You guys come here a lot?" Cody nodded again. "Every birthday. Mom says it's our tradition." He looked down at his cupcake. "She usually makes it special." Jason leaned in just slightly. "And today?" "Today she couldn't come," Cameron whispered. "She's sleeping at the hospital. We thought, maybe if we came, she'd wake up. Because she always does." Jason didn't respond right away. He just sat there, absorbing every word, feeling a strange and unfamiliar ache settle in his chest. He glanced back at the bar, where his untouched whiskey now looked irrelevant. Then he looked at the boys again, at their soft faces and hopeful silence. He realized he wasn't here for peace tonight. He had come for something else, something he never saw coming. And though he couldn't name it yet, a part of him already knew he wouldn't be walking away. Jason didn't leave the bar that night. Instead, he stayed with Cody and Cameron, and what began as a quiet, polite moment stretched into an unexpected evening. After sitting down at their table, he ordered 2 glasses of warm milk and asked the bartender if they had any extra candles, anything to make the boys smile even slightly. The bartender, moved by the sight of them, brought over a small box of crayons and a napkin, apologizing that they didn't have coloring books. Jason thanked him and handed the crayons to the boys, suggesting they draw their favorite birthday memory. Cody began sketching a large cake with flowers, while Cameron drew their mom with what looked like a crown on her head. Jason listened as they described past birthdays, how their mom used to make the best spaghetti in the world, and always sang the birthday song with a silly voice that made them laugh. They told him about the time she had baked a cake shaped like a dinosaur and accidentally dropped it on the floor, and they all ended up laughing and eating pizza instead. He watched their faces change as they remembered, sadness still present, but softened by nostalgia. He asked them if they were okay staying alone, and they explained that their neighbor, Miss Ruth, had walked them there and was supposed to come back soon. Jason made a mental note of the name, and his protective instinct sharpened. When the waitress returned to clear the plates, she gave Jason a quiet nod of appreciation, recognizing that he was doing more than just passing time. He glanced at his watch. It was well past 8. The boys were clearly tired, rubbing their eyes and yawning between sentences, but they seemed content for the first time all day. He offered to walk them back home with Miss Ruth when she arrived, and they agreed without hesitation. Something about him made them feel safe, and that realization hit him with more force than he was prepared for. 15 minutes later, a short, elderly woman appeared at the door of the bar, her coat soaked from the drizzle outside. She greeted the boys with relief and thanked Jason, though her tone was wary, as any guardians would be. Jason introduced himself politely, giving her his business card, explaining that he had stayed with them when he noticed they were alone. Miss Ruth looked down at the card, then up at him again, her eyes narrowing in recognition. "You're the man on the magazines," she said quietly. "The money man." "I suppose I am," Jason replied with a soft smile. "But tonight, I was just someone who didn't want to see 2 kids celebrate their birthday by themselves." She softened then and gave him a small nod of gratitude. The 4 of them left together, walking the boys home under Miss Ruth's worn umbrella. Jason stayed a step behind, watching the way the twins held each other's hands without needing to speak. When they reached the building, Miss Ruth insisted he didn't need to come up, but he gave her another card, just in case. As they disappeared into the stairwell, Jason stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, hands in his pockets, the cool night pressing in around him. He hadn't intended to stay. He hadn't intended to feel. But something about Cody and Cameron, about their quiet strength, their need, their story, had stirred something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Back in his apartment, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful or comforting. It was empty. He looked around at the clean, organized space, untouched by childhood chaos or laughter. For the first time, it felt wrong. That night, he didn't go over spreadsheets or emails. He sat on his couch with a notebook in hand, jotting down the boys' names, the date, the location of the bar. Something inside him had shifted, and though he didn't know what he was going to do next, he was certain of one thing: he wasn't done with Cody and Cameron. And somehow, he had a feeling his story with them had only just begun. The next morning, Jason arrived at his office early, but something about his usual routine felt hollow. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered the same sprawling view of the skyline, his desk was perfectly ordered as always, and the day's agenda was printed and waiting. But for the first time in years, he didn't sit at his desk to dive into work. Instead, he stood staring out at the city, thinking about 2 boys in paper birthday hats, alone at a table with melted cupcakes. No part of his schedule could override the weight of that image, and as the sun climbed higher, he knew he had to do something more than just remember them. He called Rachel, his longtime assistant, and asked her to come in. When she arrived with her usual calm demeanor and tablet in hand, she found him standing in the middle of the office, completely out of rhythm. She raised an eyebrow, sensing something unusual immediately. He told her about the twins, how he met them, what they'd said, and what he had seen. Rachel, sharp and deeply loyal, listened quietly, then nodded and asked, "What do you want me to do?" Jason didn't hesitate. "Find their mother. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. I think she's in a coma at City General." Rachel got to work while Jason tried, and failed, to focus on his usual meetings. He found himself distracted, tuning out presentations, staring at charts without seeing them. By lunchtime, Rachel returned to his office with information. Sarah Jenkins, age 32, had been admitted to City General 2 months ago after a car accident. Her injuries had left her in a medically induced coma. No emergency contact had been listed. The boys, Cody and Cameron, had been living in a small apartment in a modest neighborhood, under the informal care of an elderly neighbor. Child Protective Services had been made aware of the situation but hadn't intervened yet due to Sarah's prior arrangements and the boys' stability. Jason sat in silence, reading the report. Every detail made the ache in his chest deepen. They had no father listed. No extended family on file. It was just them, 2 children barely old enough to cross a street alone, managing as best they could. He asked Rachel to prepare a gift package, nothing extravagant, just groceries, a few toys, and supplies, and have it delivered anonymously. Then he asked for a driver to take him to the apartment building. He didn't know exactly what he would say when he got there. He only knew that leaving things as they were wasn't an option anymore. When he arrived, the building looked exactly how he'd imagined. A brick walk-up with peeling paint and windows framed with mismatched curtains. Miss Ruth answered the door again, surprised but not cold. She stepped aside and let him in, watching him carefully as he entered the small but tidy apartment. The boys were sitting on the floor, coloring. They looked up and smiled as soon as they saw him. "You came back," Cameron said, scrambling to his feet. "We thought maybe you wouldn't remember us," Cody added. Jason knelt down beside them and smiled. "I couldn't forget you even if I tried." They launched into stories about their day, how they'd both aced a spelling quiz and how their teacher said they could bring a show and tell item next week. Miss Ruth brought in a tray of water and crackers, and though she didn't say much, her eyes were watching Jason with less suspicion now. After an hour, when the boys were busy building a tower out of cereal boxes, Jason finally turned to her. "I'd like to help," he said quietly. "Not just with groceries or toys. I want to make sure they're okay. That they're safe. That you're not doing this all alone." Miss Ruth hesitated. "Why?" she asked, not unkindly. "You don't even know them." Jason looked toward the boys. "No, I didn't. But sometimes, you meet people and just know you're meant to do something for them. I didn't ask for it. But I don't want to walk away from it either." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you mean it, there's a lot they need. But mostly, they just need someone who won't disappear." Jason promised her he wouldn't. And as he left the apartment that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose, stripped of ego, of profit, of ambition. Just the kind of purpose that comes when a life quietly begins to change course. Jason began showing up more frequently after that evening. At first it was a couple of times a week, under the guise of checking in on Miss Ruth or dropping off groceries, but it didn't take long for his visits to become part of Cody and Cameron's new routine. The boys began expecting him, watching for the familiar black car outside their apartment window and racing to the door when he arrived. He brought puzzles, library books, and new notebooks for school. Sometimes he helped them with homework, awkward at first as he relearned fractions and spelling rules, but the boys were patient with him, and before long they were laughing together over silly mistakes and made-up vocabulary. He quickly realized they were remarkably self-sufficient for 6-year-olds. They knew how to fold their own clothes, pack their school lunches, and wash dishes without being asked. It was a survival kind of maturity, the kind that should never sit on such young shoulders. That unspoken resilience broke Jason more than their birthday had. At his office, he found himself staring at photos of balance sheets with no interest, flipping through quarterly reports without absorbing a word. He told Rachel to clear his evenings. He wasn't sure when he'd be home, and for the first time, he didn't care about appearances or what questions the board might ask. Miss Ruth, meanwhile, began to trust him. She saw how gently he spoke to the boys, how present he was, not just physically but emotionally, and that kind of consistency was something the twins hadn't had since their mother fell into a coma. Jason began picking them up from school. The first time he showed up outside their classroom, a few parents gave him confused glances, wondering what a sharply dressed man with cufflinks was doing among lunchboxes and crayon stains. But Cody and Cameron ran to him with the kind of joy that silenced any suspicion. One of their teachers even thanked him privately, explaining that the boys had seemed lighter lately, more talkative, more engaged. One rainy afternoon, Jason took them to a bookstore. He let them each choose 2 books, and while they were browsing, he bought a third one secretly. When they got home, he handed it to them as a surprise, a large, hardcover storybook filled with fables. That night, the 3 of them sat cross-legged in the living room and took turns reading aloud. Cody voiced the fox, Cameron read the prince, and Jason, to their amusement, had to speak in a high-pitched voice for the fairy. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. And it was the first time in years that Jason had gone to bed feeling not just tired, but full. Later that week, Miss Ruth pulled him aside. They stood in the hallway of the apartment building, just outside the door, the boys inside cleaning up their paper crafts. She looked at him with clear eyes, tired but kind. "They're changing," she said. "Not because of gifts or games. But because they trust you now. They think you're going to stay." Jason swallowed hard. "I am." She nodded. "Good. Because if you weren't, I'd tell you to stop coming." He understood. The boys had been let down before. They didn't need another promise that came and went. That night, as Jason sat in his car outside the building, he pulled out his phone and opened the contact for his legal team. His fingers hovered over the screen for a long time. He wasn't ready to explain everything to the world, not yet. But he was ready to take responsibility in ways that mattered. He sent a short message, "Need to talk about temporary guardianship." Discreetly. It was the first official step. But in his heart, the real decision had already been made the moment Cody handed him that crayon drawing of the 3 of them holding hands under a bright blue sky. The words, "Our family," were written in messy 6-year-old letters at the bottom. He kept it in his briefcase from that day on. One Friday morning, Jason arrived at the hospital earlier than he planned. He hadn't visited Sarah Jenkins before, though he had received regular updates through contacts he trusted. He had wanted to give the boys stability first, to make sure they had someone present for them before he shifted his attention to the woman who had raised them alone. But today something inside him felt restless, an urgency he couldn't quite explain. He walked down the long, sterile corridor of the hospital with a quiet tension in his chest, carrying a small bouquet of flowers he had picked up on the way, yellow tulips, the kind Cameron once said were their mom's favorite. When he reached her room, the door was half open, and the room inside was dimly lit. Machines hummed softly, a steady rhythm of monitored breaths and beeps. Sarah lay motionless in the bed, her face pale but calm, her brown hair brushed back neatly on the pillow. She looked peaceful, almost as if she were just sleeping. Jason stepped in quietly and stood near the foot of the bed, unsure of what to say or do. He had faced some of the most powerful people in the world in boardrooms, had negotiated deals worth millions, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this silent moment. He placed the flowers in a narrow glass vase on the small table by the window and sat down in the chair beside her bed. For a long time, he just watched her breathe, not speaking, just trying to imagine the life she'd lived with Cody and Cameron before everything changed. He didn't know what kind of mother she had been, but if the boys were any reflection of her, she must have been extraordinary, strong, loving, endlessly patient. He thought about how fiercely they protected her memory, how they still clung to routines she had created, as if keeping them alive would bring her back. After a while, he began to speak. His voice was low, uncertain at first. He told her who he was, not as the CEO or a man with wealth and power, but as the stranger who couldn't walk away from her sons. He told her about their birthday, about the cupcakes and paper hats, about the way they sat together with hope in their eyes and no one around to light their candles. He told her how they had let him into their lives without hesitation, how they laughed when he read bedtime stories, how they asked him things like whether foxes could live in cities and whether pancakes could be square. He told her how much they missed her. As he spoke, something shifted in him. The guilt he hadn't allowed himself to name until now started rising. Not because he had failed them, but because he had waited so long to let this part of himself exist. He apologized to Sarah, quietly and without expectation. He promised he would do everything he could to protect them until she woke up, and even after. He said he didn't want to replace her or take anything away. He only wanted to be what the boys needed. And maybe, if life allowed it, he could be that for her too. Just before he stood to leave, he gently reached for her hand. It was cool but warm enough to tell him that life still pulsed beneath the skin. He held it lightly in his own and gave it the smallest squeeze, not expecting anything in return. But in that fragile silence, her fingers moved. Only slightly, barely more than a twitch. He froze. Then it happened again. He rushed to the nurse's station, his voice calm but urgent, explaining what he saw. Within minutes, doctors and nurses were in the room, surrounding her with quiet efficiency, checking monitors, asking questions, making notes. Jason stood back, heart pounding, watching the chaos unfold with a strange mix of hope and fear. One of the nurses turned to him and said, "This is a good sign." "Very good." He didn't say anything. He just nodded, eyes fixed on Sarah's still face, his thoughts spinning. As he left the hospital, he didn't call the office. He called Rachel and told her to cancel his weekend meetings. Then he called Miss Ruth and asked her to tell the boys he'd be coming over early that evening, and that he had news. What he didn't say was that something was changing, something big, something irreversible. He didn't know what the next step looked like, but he was finally ready for whatever it would be. Because this wasn't just about stepping in anymore. It was about standing beside them, fully and without hesitation. And for the first time in his life, Jason Carter was no longer afraid of what that might mean. When Jason arrived at the apartment that evening, he found the boys sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, building something with old blocks and cereal boxes. Cameron looked up first, his eyes lighting up when he saw Jason standing in the doorway. Cody followed, immediately setting down the piece he was holding to run over and hug him. Their energy was so pure, so trusting, that Jason had to pause for a moment before speaking, unsure how to deliver the news in a way they would understand. Miss Ruth emerged from the kitchen, drying her hands on a towel, and gave him a quiet nod of acknowledgement before retreating, sensing that this moment belonged to them. Jason knelt down on the floor beside the boys and gently asked them to sit with him for a moment. Their smiles faded slightly, not out of fear, but because they sensed something important was coming. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph that the hospital staff had given him earlier that day. It was a simple shot of their mother in her hospital bed, her eyes still closed but her face serene and peaceful. He handed it to Cody, who stared at it in silence, and then passed it to his brother. "I went to see your mom today," Jason said quietly, watching their faces carefully. "She moved her hand while I was there. The doctors think it means she's starting to wake up." For a moment, neither boy said anything. Then Cameron's lower lip began to tremble. "Really?" he whispered, holding the photo tightly against his chest. Jason nodded, and suddenly Cody was clinging to his side, arms wrapped tightly around him, face buried in Jason's shoulder. Cameron followed, and the three of them sat there on the rug in a tangle of small arms and quiet tears. They weren't loud sobs, they were the kind of tears that came from months of fear slowly unraveling into hope. When they had calmed, Jason helped them settle onto the couch and let them ask anything they wanted. They asked what the hospital smelled like, whether their mom had spoken, if she had asked about them. Jason answered each question as gently and truthfully as he could. He told them that she hadn't spoken yet but that the doctors were optimistic. He told them that she was in a quiet room with flowers and soft music, that someone was always there checking on her. He told them that he had held her hand and promised to take care of them until she was better. After a long pause, Cody looked at him seriously and asked, "Will you still come even if she wakes up?" Jason felt the weight of the question like a stone in his chest. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Not ever." The boys nodded, and Jason could see that it mattered more than anything else he had said. He spent the night helping them draw pictures for their mom, bright, messy sketches of trees and houses, one with a fox wearing sunglasses and one of the four of them sitting in a garden. He promised to deliver them to the hospital in the morning, and they made him rehearse exactly what he would say when he showed her the drawings. Before bed, they insisted he read a chapter from their favorite book. As he read, his voice soft and steady, he noticed Cody resting his head on his lap, and Cameron curling up beside him. They didn't ask if he would stay until they fell asleep. They didn't need to. When the story ended and their breathing had deepened into sleep, Jason remained there for a while, one hand resting lightly on Cody's back. Miss Ruth peeked in from the hallway and whispered, "You're doing more for them than you even realize." Jason looked up, his expression both humbled and resolute. "I hope so. I just want them to feel safe." "They do," she said simply. "And it's changing them. You're giving them something they didn't think they could have anymore." Jason tucked the boys in and turned out the light. As he stood at the window looking out into the dark, he realized that he wasn't just part of their lives temporarily. He had become something solid. Something permanent. He thought about Sarah lying in the hospital bed, about the hope in her son's eyes, and about the promise he had made aloud and silently again and again. This was no longer about redemption or duty. It was about love. Real, rooted, transformative love that demanded presence and patience and courage. And for the first time in his life, Jason understood exactly what that meant. In the days following Sarah's brief movement, Jason visited the hospital every morning before the sun had fully risen. He sat beside her, sometimes reading aloud from the book the boys had chosen, other times simply talking to her about the drawings they had made or how Cameron had spilled juice on the carpet and tried to clean it with sock puppets. He brought in their pictures one at a time and taped them gently to the wall beside her bed, so she would see them if and when she opened her eyes. He spoke to her as if she were already listening, not out of optimism but because deep inside, he believed she was. The doctors continued to monitor her closely, and though progress was slow, the staff agreed that something had changed. At home, Jason was fully immersed in the lives of Cody and Cameron. He had rearranged his work schedule entirely, leaving the firm in the hands of trusted executives and working remotely when necessary. His penthouse, once pristine and empty, now resembled the home of a man with two 6-year-olds, books and toys filled the living room, drawings were taped to the refrigerator, and bedtime was no longer negotiable. He had even learned how to braid tangled curls, how to make grilled cheese without burning it, and how to explain thunderstorms without using science. His days, once scheduled down to the second, were now driven by lunchbox preferences, bedtime rituals, and which twin had hidden the other's sock. One evening, as he helped the boys build a blanket fort in the living room, Rachel called. She told him that the legal paperwork he had filed for temporary guardianship had gone through with no opposition. The courts had acknowledged the emergency and his involvement and granted him full care for as long as necessary. Jason stood in the kitchen after the call, staring out the window, the paperwork in his hands, feeling the weight of what that meant. He hadn't just stepped into a role temporarily, he had built a life with them, one that was now recognized by law. And though that terrified him in some small way, it filled him with something far stronger than fear. That weekend, they went to the park together. It was a cool spring afternoon, the sun warm enough to loosen jackets, and the grass damp with morning dew. Cody brought a kite that Jason had helped him patch together with tape and string, while Cameron insisted on bringing a soccer ball that was almost half his size. They ran across the open field, laughing so loudly it made a few strangers stop and smile. Jason chased after them, not caring who saw him in his dress shoes slipping in the mud, not caring how foolish he might have looked. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed without thinking about what came next. As they sat on the grass eating sandwiches and juice boxes, Cameron looked up and asked suddenly, "Did you have a dad when you were little?" Jason hesitated, then said, "Not really. Not one who stayed." The boys were quiet for a moment. Then Cody said, "We didn't either. Until now." Jason felt the sting behind his eyes, but he didn't look away. He simply reached out and pulled them both into a quiet, protective hug. Later that night, as he tucked them into bed, Cody asked if their mom would ever meet him. Jason told them the truth, that he hoped so, and that if she did, he would tell her everything. How strong they were, how much they missed her, how much they had grown. He didn't promise anything he couldn't keep, but he told them the most important truth of all: no matter what happened, he wasn't leaving. Ever. As he turned off the lights and stood in the doorway, he realized the ache in his chest wasn't fear anymore. It was something deeper, something rooted. The kind of feeling that comes only when you've stopped waiting for a life to begin and started living it fully. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, Jason understood that this wasn't about what he had lost or what he had missed. It was about what he had chosen to build, piece by piece, from a single unexpected moment into something whole and lasting. The morning Sarah finally opened her eyes was quiet and cloudless. Jason had just arrived at the hospital, a coffee in one hand and the boy's newest drawings rolled up under his arm. He entered her room expecting the usual stillness, the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft hum of the oxygen line, but something felt different the moment he stepped inside. A nurse was already there, gently adjusting Sarah's blanket, and she turned with a soft smile when she saw him. "She's awake," the nurse said simply, and Jason froze. He moved slowly toward the bed, not wanting to startle her, not wanting to believe too quickly in something he had only allowed himself to hope for in small, silent moments. Sarah looked at him with groggy, half-focused eyes. Her gaze flickered over his face, unfamiliar and familiar at once, as if her brain were racing to catch up with the world around her. He lowered himself into the chair beside her and spoke softly, telling her his name, reminding her gently of the day he met her sons. At the mention of Cody and Cameron, her eyes welled with tears. She couldn't speak yet, but she reached for his hand, and when he gave it to her, she clutched it with surprising strength. He promised her they were safe, that they were happy, that they had been so brave. He told her they had never stopped waiting for her. Over the next few days, as she slowly regained strength and comprehension, Jason visited daily. He brought the boys once she was strong enough, and the reunion was both tearful and full of laughter. Cody ran into her arms the moment he saw her, nearly knocking over her four-stand, while Cameron simply stood by the bed, his lower lip trembling until she pulled him in two. The three of them cried and clung to each other, and Jason stood back and watched with a heart so full it felt as if it would burst. He didn't interrupt. He didn't claim space. He just let them be together. Sarah learned everything in small pieces. At first she was overwhelmed, confused by how much time had passed, by how her boys had been living without her. But when she heard how Jason had stepped in, not out of obligation but out of instinct and care, she was quiet for a long time. Later that afternoon, when the boys had gone to the hospital playroom and the room was quiet again, she turned to Jason and asked the question he had been expecting but dreading. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice weak but steady. "You didn't know us. You could have walked away." He looked at her and answered honestly. "I tried to walk away. That night in the bar, I almost did. But then I saw them. And something in me knew that I couldn't unsee it. I didn't plan this. I didn't expect it. But they needed someone. And it turns out, I did too. Sarah listened with eyes that held both caution and warmth. She nodded slowly. They love you, she said. They talk about you like you've always been there. He smiled. I plan to be. If you'll let me. Sarah didn't respond right away. But she didn't say no. And that, for Jason, was enough. Weeks later, Sarah was strong enough to return home. Jason helped ready the apartment, fixing things she hadn't had the time or energy to deal with before. They painted the boys' room, set up a reading corner, and even hung the drawings Jason had kept. The boys insisted on a family dinner to celebrate her return, and it ended in a pillow fight that left them all breathless with laughter. There was no speech, no grand declaration, but when Jason took a photo of the four of them piled on the couch afterward, something about it felt permanent. Life didn't return to how it was before. It became something entirely new. Jason didn't just remain a part of the boys' lives, he and Sarah found themselves slowly, unexpectedly drawn to each other in ways neither had expected. There was no rush. No pressure. Just quiet dinners, long talks after bedtime, and the steady realization that sometimes love grows not out of romance, but out of the choice to stay. And in choosing them, again and again, Jason had rewritten the very structure of his life. Not with strategies or investments, but with bedtime stories, hospital visits, and small promises kept. He had found something he never thought he needed. Something he now couldn't imagine living without. Not success. Not redemption. But a family. What makes the ending of this story powerful is its quiet, earned transformation. Jason's journey isn't about saving others to redeem himself, it's about learning how to be present, vulnerable, and truly connected after years of chasing status over substance. The beauty lies in the fact that no one demanded he change, the boys didn't ask him to become a father figure, and Sarah didn't expect a savior. But he chose to show up, again and again, until love grew not from grand gestures, but from consistency, care, and the courage to build a life that wasn't perfect, just real. That's what makes the ending so satisfying, not that everyone gets what they want, but that they find what they didn't know they needed. He never donated a cent to charity and didn't believe in second chances, until two dancing twin girls with his face and her eyes shattered everything he thought he knew. Garrett Winslow never donated to charity. He didn't write checks for causes, didn't sponsor galas, and never offered up his name for foundation plaques or hospital wings. In fact, he went out of his way to avoid events that involved anything resembling compassion. To him, charity was a sentimental distraction for people who didn't understand how the world really worked. He built skyscrapers, not sympathy. Everything he touched turned to profit. People respected him, or feared him, but no one would have dared to call him warm. And that was just how he liked it. He was a striking man, the kind people noticed the moment he entered a room. Tall, broad-shouldered, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits. His hair, a soft cascade of golden curls, framed a face that was all angles, strong jaw, high cheekbones, eyes so piercingly blue they looked like polished glass. Everything about Garrett was sharp, polished, expensive. But there was no softness in him, not anymore. He had spent too many years in boardrooms and construction sites, too many late nights reviewing contracts and acquisitions, too much time building a world where nothing was left to chance. Kindness was for amateurs. Garrett built his empire with steel and concrete and certainty. So when he mistakenly showed up at the wrong venue that Thursday night, a charity event for children's art programs instead of the exclusive investor dinner he'd meant to attend, his first instinct was to turn around and leave. The ballroom was decorated with paper cranes and string lights, not crystal chandeliers and caviar. Children's paintings lined the hallway. A small string quartet played an overly cheerful tune near the entrance. It wasn't his scene. He took a step toward the exit, irritated with his assistant, already composing the scolding email in his mind. But then, just as he turned, the lights dimmed and a voice announced the next performance. From the Hope Studio Ballet program, please welcome Emma and Evie Moore." The audience clapped politely. Garrett barely registered the names. He wasn't listening. Until the music started. Two little girls stepped onto the stage in matching white ballet dresses. Their golden curls shimmered under the spotlight. Their faces, round, angelic, completely identical, were filled with a calm, concentrated grace far beyond their age. And their eyes. Blue. The exact same rare, ice-clear blue he saw every morning in the mirror. Garrett's body locked. He couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The girls danced with flawless synchronicity, spinning and leaping across the stage with surprising confidence. The room faded around him. There was no orchestra, no audience, no clinking of wine glasses. Just them. These two perfect, impossible mirrors of himself. And yet, he had never seen them before. He told himself it couldn't be real. That the resemblance was a trick of the light, that children often looked like adults, that it was coincidence. But he knew better. It was more than a resemblance. It was recognition. His jaw clenched, and his hands curled into fists at his sides, not from anger, but from something else, shock, maybe. Or fear. As the performance ended and the room erupted in applause, Garrett didn't clap. He simply stared. One of the girls gave a small bow, and as her arm moved gracefully toward her side, the light caught on something silver around her wrist. A bracelet. Delicate, thin, and shining. A shape and style that twisted something deep in his gut. He had seen that bracelet before. Years ago. And suddenly, everything he thought he knew about his life began to crack. The applause faded into a soft murmur, but Garrett remained frozen in place, his eyes locked on the two girls as they left the stage, still hand in hand. His mind refused to process what he had just witnessed. The resemblance was too precise, too perfect. It wasn't just their eyes or the way their curls bounced with each step, it was something deeper, something instinctual. A pull. A recognition. And that bracelet. That damn bracelet. A thin silver band, barely noticeable unless the light hit it just right. But he had seen it before. Years ago. On the wrist of a woman whose name he had almost managed to forget. He moved without thinking, weaving through the crowd, ignoring the polite conversations and curious glances as he followed the hallway toward the backstage area. A volunteer tried to stop him, but he brushed past with a cold look that didn't invite argument. He wasn't a man used to being told no. His shoes clicked against the polished floor as he rounded a corner and found a small corridor where children were gathering after their performances, laughing, hugging their instructors, their parents. And then he saw her. Not the girls, though they were there too, seated on a bench, sipping from juice boxes, but the woman beside them. Late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a dancer's posture and a tired kind of beauty. Auburn brown hair pulled into a messy bun, dark circles under her eyes that didn't hide the quiet fire in them. She crouched down to adjust one of the girl's ballet slippers and whispered something that made them both giggle. Garrett approached slowly. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't have a plan. He just knew he had to know. The woman stood up as he got closer and looked at him, puzzled. She didn't seem to recognize him, which somehow made it worse. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but steady. "Those girls, are they yours?" Her expression shifted immediately, defensive, protective. "Why do you ask?" Her tone was firm, but not rude. Garrett hesitated. "Because they look exactly like me." There was a pause. A deep, stretching silence. One of the girls, Emma, he thought, looked up and blinked at him with wide, curious eyes. The other kept sipping her juice, unaware of the storm gathering in the adult world. The woman straightened, arms crossed now. "I'm their aunt," she said. "Their mother was my sister." Garrett's heart pounded. "Was?" "She passed away," the woman said. 6 years ago. During childbirth. He felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. He had assumed, no, not assumed, hoped, that the mother would be someone he could confront, someone who could explain. But the thought that she was gone, that she had died bringing them into the world, tightened something sharp in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "I didn't know." "What was her name?" The woman studied him, trying to read something in his expression. "Maggie. Maggie Moore." The name landed like a punch to the gut. Garrett had only known her for a short time, but he remembered the way she danced, the sound of her laugh, the softness in her voice when she said his name. They had spent one whirlwind weekend together, years ago, in a haze of music, wine, and something dangerously close to love. He never saw her again after that. He never looked. And now it was too late. "I knew her," he said quietly. "A long time ago. We were together. Briefly." The woman's eyes narrowed. "And your name is?" "Garrett Winslow." She inhaled sharply. You're him." There was recognition now. Not from a photo or a memory, but from the stories her sister must have told. "She mentioned you." "Once." Garrett nodded, overwhelmed. "And the bracelet?" he asked. "The one your niece was wearing." It looked like. "It was Maggie's," the woman said. "She wore it every day until she died. She gave it to Emma right before the girls turned 5. Told them it was from someone special." He swallowed hard. His past had never caught up with him like this. It had always been something he outran. But now it stood in front of him, sipping juice and smiling with the same crooked grin he had at that age. "Do they know?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The woman hesitated. "They know their mother loved someone very much. They don't know his name." Garrett looked down at the girls again. They weren't afraid of him. Not yet. They looked at him the way children look at anyone new, curiously, openly, without judgment. There was still time. "I want to know them," he said. "If you'll let me." The woman's eyes softened slightly, but the wariness didn't leave her face. "They've already lost enough. I won't let anyone else disappear on them." "I'm not going to disappear," he said, and this time, he wasn't just making a promise. He was making a vow. Garrett didn't sleep that night. He sat in his penthouse, surrounded by silence and glass, the city lights outside casting reflections he didn't recognize anymore. The bracelet, the girls, Maggie's name echoing in that quiet hallway backstage, every moment replayed over and over in his mind, refusing to let him rest. His chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in years, not since before he learned to bury anything that wasn't useful. But this wasn't something he could compartmentalize. He couldn't file it away under distraction or irrelevant. These girls weren't strangers. They were a part of him. By morning, he was already on the phone with one of the most discreet private investigators in New York, giving the man only 2 things, Maggie Moore's name and the year she died. He didn't tell him why, just that it was urgent. Within 48 hours, the file was in his hands. Garrett didn't know what he expected, but the report hit harder than anything he'd imagined. Maggie had died in a small local hospital after unexpected complications during childbirth. No father was listed on the birth certificates. Lauren Moore, her older sister, had stepped in as guardian immediately. No legal disputes. No questions. No extended family had come forward, and the girls had remained in Lauren's care ever since. They'd moved 3 times, always in modest neighborhoods, never far from dance schools or community centers. Lauren had taken on multiple jobs over the years, teaching, cleaning, whatever kept them fed and together. Garrett read the report twice, then set it down and stared out the window for a long time. Guilt was unfamiliar territory for him, but now it settled like an anchor in his gut. Maggie had died alone, giving life to 2 children who would never know her. And all the while, he'd been in boardrooms, winning awards, breaking records, convincing himself that his past didn't matter. He didn't want to just show up again without a plan, so he reached out to Lauren through a quiet channel, an assistant of hers from the studio who agreed to pass along a letter. It wasn't long or dramatic. He kept it simple, he wanted to help. Financially, emotionally, however she would allow. He wasn't asking to take the girls away or to disrupt their lives. He just wanted to be present. Lauren didn't respond immediately. But 4 days later, she called. Her voice was wary, but not cold. She told him the girls had asked about him, Emma, especially. She said the bracelet had become something sacred to them, a link to a story they didn't understand but deeply believed in. Lauren didn't promise him anything, but she agreed to let him visit. Not alone. Not yet. But he could come to the studio, observe quietly, and maybe, just maybe, begin to build something that looked like trust. The following afternoon, Garrett arrived early. The studio was small and worn around the edges, but it was filled with life. Kids giggled in the hallways, teachers offered gentle corrections, soft piano music drifted from one of the practice rooms. It was nothing like the steel and glass world he was used to. And it was beautiful. He stayed near the doorway, watching from a distance as the twins stretched at the bar. They moved in perfect sync, their expressions focused, their golden curls pinned back in matching buns. They hadn't seen him yet. He didn't want to startle them. Lauren approached him a few minutes later, arms crossed but a little less guarded. They've had good days and bad, she said quietly. They don't understand everything yet. But they're curious. Especially Emma. Evie's more cautious. She watches people before she lets them in. Garrett nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions. What were they like when they were babies? What was Maggie like in her final days? Did they talk about her? Did they talk about him? But he held it in. When class ended, the girls ran off to change, and Lauren offered him a moment to speak with them in the lobby. It was brief. Polite. Emma said hi first. Evie waved from behind her. He didn't try to touch them or push too hard. He just knelt to their level and said, I'm glad I got to see you dance. You were both amazing. Emma smiled shyly. Do you dance? Garrett laughed softly. Not even a little. She giggled. Evie stayed quiet, but she didn't look away. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't dramatic. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, Garrett felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Garrett started visiting the studio regularly. At first, he kept his distance, standing quietly in corners, nodding to the instructors, never interfering. The girls began to notice him more. Emma would glance over her shoulder while stretching, flash a quick smile when she caught him watching, and then turn back to her routine like nothing had happened. Evie was slower to warm up. She rarely looked directly at him, but she never avoided him either. She observed him quietly, the way cautious children often do, with wide eyes and questions she didn't know how to ask yet. Lauren kept her promise, allowing him to be present but monitoring everything closely. She never left them alone with him, and Garrett didn't push for that. He knew he hadn't earned anything yet, not really. He was a stranger trying to undo a silence that had lasted nearly 7 years. And he understood something now that he hadn't before, being there wasn't about showing up once or twice with grand gestures. It was about consistency, humility, patience. Things no one had ever required from him until now. He started bringing small things. A new box of art supplies when he noticed the girls using worn-out crayons. Fresh leotards in soft pastel colors, careful to buy matching sets for both. He asked Lauren first every time. He didn't want to overstep. He didn't want to look like he was trying to buy their affection. But the girls didn't see it that way. They began to approach him after class, slowly at first. Emma asked questions, about his job, about buildings, about whether he'd ever been to Paris. Evie listened, and sometimes, she'd whisper a single-word comment to her sister and then smile when he responded. One rainy afternoon, Garrett offered to drive them home when Lauren's car wouldn't start. She hesitated, but the storm was getting worse, and the girls were already soaked from running to the studio entrance. In the car, Emma sat in the front seat, peppering him with questions about everything on the dashboard, while Evie stared out the window, quietly watching the rain streak across the glass. Garrett told them about his first building project, how he had once been terrified of public speaking, how he used to sneak out of piano lessons as a child. They laughed. It was small, silly stuff, but it was real. Later that week, he showed up at the studio with a surprise, a miniature-scale model of a building, designed with little ballet dancers carved into the facade. "I thought maybe someday you'd like to help design something like this," he told them. Emma beamed. Evie stepped closer to study the tiny details. Lauren stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching everything unfold. Her expression was unreadable, but she didn't stop him. Eventually, Garrett was invited to their recital. It was a big moment, one Lauren hadn't offered lightly. He dressed in a simple navy sweater and jeans, trying not to look like a man who once lived in custom-tailored suits. The auditorium was packed, full of parents and teachers, music echoing off the walls. When the twins took the stage, Garrett's breath caught. They moved in perfect harmony, every step light and deliberate, their faces filled with quiet joy. He didn't know anything about ballet, but he knew what pride felt like. And it hit him with a force he wasn't ready for. After the performance, Emma ran straight to him. "Did you see? Did you see us?" she asked, cheeks flushed and eyes shining. Garrett bent down and pulled her into a hug without thinking. She wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. Evie approached more slowly but stood beside him, close enough for her shoulder to brush against his. He looked down at them both and smiled. "You were incredible," he said. "I've never seen anything so beautiful." Lauren came over, holding their coats, and something in her expression had changed. Not completely. Not surrender. But something softer. "They talk about you," she said quietly as the girls ran ahead. "More and more every day." Garrett nodded. He knew what that meant. They were letting him in. Not all at once, and not without fear. But they were opening the door. And this time, he was staying. As the weeks passed, Garrett's presence became part of the girls' routine. He was no longer just a figure in the background or a mysterious adult who watched from the sidelines. He was the man who waited for them after class, who asked about their day, who remembered which of them liked strawberries and which hated them, who carried their bags when they were tired and tied their shoelaces without being asked. There was still distance, especially with Evie, who remained more guarded, but even she had started to offer quiet smiles and small nods in his direction. Emma, in contrast, had fully embraced his presence. She told him about her dreams, her classmates, the way she wanted to go to Paris and dance on rooftops. She drew pictures for him, little crayon sketches of buildings with wings, stages in the clouds, and once, one that made him stop breathing for a moment, a family of 3 holding hands under a tree. She had labeled them in shaky handwriting, me, Evie, and Dad. When she gave it to him, she did it casually, without ceremony, but Garrett kept it folded in his wallet like it was the most valuable document he'd ever owned. He began to take on more responsibilities, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to. He picked them up from school when Lauren was working late. He learned how to braid hair by watching YouTube videos late into the night. He helped them rehearse lines for a school play, even acting out the smaller roles with exaggerated voices that made them fall over laughing. They started calling him Dad one at a time. First Emma, testing it in a whisper like trying out a new pair of shoes. Then Evie, quietly and without eye contact, like she was releasing something she'd been holding in for far too long. The first time he heard it, he didn't respond immediately, not out of shock, but because the word hit him with so much weight he didn't trust his voice not to crack. It wasn't just the girls who changed. Garrett changed too. He stopped checking his email every 5 minutes. His phone stayed in his pocket more often. He didn't wake up thinking about quarterly profits or stock prices. Instead, he thought about whether the girls had clean ballet tights, if he had enough groceries for their favorite snacks, whether he'd remembered to sign the school form for Friday's field trip. It was a different kind of stress, quieter but more meaningful. He found himself laughing more. Sleeping better. Feeling human in a way he hadn't in years. Lauren saw the change as well. Slowly, her walls came down. They shared coffee some mornings after school drop-off. She told him stories about Maggie, how she'd dance in the living room to old French songs, how she used to believe that music could fix everything. Garrett listened more than he spoke. He wanted to collect those fragments of Maggie, to piece together a picture of the woman he never really got to know. Sometimes, Lauren would leave the girls with him for short periods. An hour turned into an afternoon. Then a whole evening. It was never spoken aloud, but the trust was being rebuilt, breath by breath. Then, one night, Garrett got a call. It was Evie's voice, soft and trembling. She had woken from a nightmare and asked Lauren if she could call him. He didn't ask questions. He just told her to breathe, that he was here, that she was safe. She didn't say much, but she stayed on the line until her breathing evened out. After she hung up, Garrett sat in silence, holding the phone in his hand like it had suddenly become the most sacred object he owned. He wasn't trying to replace Maggie. He couldn't. But he was becoming something else, something real, something steady, something that could be counted on. Not a visitor. Not a temporary presence. A father. And though the journey had been slow, filled with small moments and tentative steps, Garrett understood now that this was what love really looked like. Not grand declarations or perfect timing. Just staying. Choosing to stay, even when it was hard. Especially then. It had been nearly a year since Garrett first walked into that charity recital by mistake, and everything in his life had changed since then. He had built his world out of steel, strategy, and solitude, but now it was filled with dance shoes in the hallway, glitter-covered school projects on the fridge, and 2 little girls who clung to him like he had always been there. He didn't miss his old life, not the boardrooms, not the endless deadlines, not the empty victories that used to thrill him. For the first time, his success wasn't measured in numbers but in moments, like the way Evie now reached for his hand without thinking, or how Emma had started calling him Dad without hesitation, like the word had always belonged to him. But happiness has a way of drawing shadows. It started with a letter, an official-looking envelope delivered to Lauren's mailbox. At first, Garrett thought it was a mistake, until Lauren called him with tension in her voice and said, "You need to come over. Now." When he arrived, she handed him the letter and watched as he read it in silence. It was from a woman named Judith Carter, Maggie's aunt. Someone Garrett had never heard of, and apparently, neither had Lauren in over a decade. The letter stated that Judith had learned about the twins and intended to seek custody, citing concerns about their current living situation and the sudden involvement of a wealthy stranger claiming to be their father. She was threatening legal action. Garrett's initial reaction was fury. Where had this woman been when Maggie died? Where was she during all the nights Lauren stayed up comforting 2 newborns on her own? Where was she when the girls needed new shoes or medicine or help with school? He had seen this kind of tactic before, in business, when people saw opportunity and tried to mask greed with righteousness. But this was different. This was personal. Lauren, for her part, was less angry and more afraid. She knew how the system worked. She had raised the girls without official adoption, acting as their legal guardian under emergency family placement. And now that Garrett was involved, with his high profile and sudden presence, the story looked messy. The courts didn't always care about love, about effort, about sleepless nights. Sometimes, they just looked at the paper. They tried to stay calm for the girls, but children always know when something is wrong. Evie started asking if she and Emma were going to have to move. Emma clung to Garrett when he said goodnight, whispering, "You won't let them take us, right?" Garrett held her tightly and told her the truth. Not a chance. Their lawyers warned them that Judith had hired a powerful family law attorney known for using personal scandals to sway cases. Almost immediately, Garrett's past became public property. Articles began to surface. Billionaire CEO claims secret children. Cold empire builder turned sudden father. Old photos, headlines, quotes from former colleagues who were all too eager to paint him as emotionally unavailable and image-obsessed flooded the internet. His reputation crumbled overnight. Investors pulled out of partnerships. Boards requested his resignation from projects he'd spent years building. The press didn't care about truth. They wanted the narrative. But Garrett didn't fight back in the way the world expected. He didn't launch PR campaigns or hire reputation consultants. He focused on one thing, protecting the girls. He doubled down on presence. He showed up at every school function, every doctor's appointment, every rehearsal. He answered their questions with honesty, not promises. He sat through court evaluations with quiet strength and let the facts speak for themselves. He told the truth, how he hadn't known they existed, how he regretted the years he'd missed, and how he was willing to lose everything else to make sure they stayed where they belonged. The court hearings were brutal. Judith painted Lauren as unstable and Garrett as opportunistic. But then the girls were called to speak, not in front of the whole courtroom, but in private sessions with child advocates. And it was their words that began to shift everything. Emma described how Garrett made her feel safe. Evie said he never forced her to talk, just listened until she was ready. They both said the word home when they talked about him. And it was home. Chaotic and imperfect, yes, but full of love. When the judge finally delivered the decision, there was a long pause that felt like it cracked time in half. Judith's petition was denied. Full guardianship would remain with Lauren, and Garrett was granted full legal recognition as their father, with shared custody. The judge emphasized that the best interest of the children had been met not through blood alone, but through presence, consistency, and commitment. Garrett didn't smile or celebrate when he heard the ruling. He just looked at Lauren, then at the girls sitting behind her, and exhaled for the first time in weeks. There was still a long road ahead. But they weren't going anywhere. And neither was he. The weeks after the custody ruling felt like breathing after nearly drowning. There was no explosion of joy, no grand celebration, just a quiet settling, a sense that, for the first time, the ground beneath them had stopped shifting. Garrett hadn't just fought to keep his daughters close, he had dismantled the very version of himself that once believed he didn't need anyone. Now, every part of his life was built around those two little girls and the woman who had raised them when no one else did. It wasn't simple. Healing never was. But the chaos had cleared, and in its place was something real. Garrett sold the penthouse. It felt like a monument to a man he no longer was. He bought a small house in the same neighborhood as the studio, a modest, sunlit home with a yard where the girls could play and a kitchen big enough for baking messes. He didn't care that it lacked sleek finishes or high-rise views. What mattered were the tiny ballet shoes by the door, the drawings taped to the fridge, and the laughter that bounced off the walls. He painted the girls' bedroom himself, chose matching beds, and helped them string fairy lights above their windows. Emma insisted on stars. Evie wanted bookshelves. He gave them both. Lauren still lived a few streets away, but she was there nearly every day. They hadn't defined what they were now, family, partners in parenting, something more, but it didn't matter. Their connection was unspoken but deeply felt. Sometimes they'd talk for hours over coffee, sometimes they'd simply exchange tired glances over homework and dinner prep, understanding everything without saying much at all. Garrett had learned to listen. He no longer filled silences with solutions. He sat with them, waited, and let things unfold. That was the greatest gift fatherhood had given him, patience he never knew he was capable of. His old life still hovered in headlines. There were articles questioning his sincerity, analyzing his downfall, speculating on whether his reinvention was strategic or sincere. He ignored them. People could say what they wanted. He no longer measured himself by their opinions. His empire was gone, but he didn't miss it. He had traded marble floors for sidewalk chalk and never looked back. He spent his mornings walking the girls to school, waving at the same neighbors he used to overlook. He helped with recitals, chaperoned field trips, sat through endless show-and-tell presentations. The community had begun to see him differently, not as the cold mogul from the news, but as the man who showed up every day, rain or shine, no press, no speeches, just presence. The girls trusted him now in a way that ran deeper than words. They didn't ask if he was staying anymore. They knew. One night, after tucking them in, he stood in the hallway and looked at a framed photo on the wall, a picture of Maggie, smiling with the twins in her arms. It had been taken just weeks before her death. The photo was a little faded, the frame handmade by the girls in art class, covered in dried glitter and crooked stickers. Beneath it sat the bracelet. Garrett had placed it in a shadow box, right next to a note Maggie had once written and that Lauren had found tucked in a journal. It wasn't long, just a few lines, but he read them often. If anything happens to me, I hope they find someone who sees them, not for what they are, but for who they could become. Someone who stays. Garrett wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't want applause or redemption. He only wanted to be the man Maggie had believed might still exist inside him. And he wanted to be worthy of the trust his daughters had given him, trust built not on blood, but on showing up again and again, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it hurt, even when it would have been easier to disappear. The world outside still called him Garrett Winslow, former CEO, fallen tycoon, man who lost everything. But inside that little house with the squeaky door and mismatched mugs, he was simply Dad. And it was more than enough. Spring arrived quietly, like a whisper rather than a declaration. The air grew softer, the days longer, and the trees along Garrett Street began to bloom with tiny pink blossoms that fluttered down like confetti every time the wind passed through. It had been a full year since the night he walked into that charity recital by mistake, only it no longer felt like a mistake. It felt inevitable, like the world had been slowly guiding him toward that moment, toward the two little girls who had cracked open his life and made space for something better. Life had settled into a rhythm that once would have terrified him with its simplicity. Morning chaos was the new board meeting, packing lunches, finding missing shoes, brushing tangled hair while pouring coffee. He still made mistakes. Once he forgot Evie's dance bag and had to drive back through city traffic with a bag of leotards and snacks, arriving just as the music started, but he learned to laugh at himself, and the girls laughed with him. Even Lauren laughed more these days. She no longer looked like she was holding the weight of the world on her shoulders alone. They had become a team, even if neither of them had put a name to it. Some things didn't need names to be real. Garrett had created something unexpected in the year since his world unraveled, a small nonprofit named the Maggie Moore Foundation, dedicated to supporting community arts programs and single parents. He didn't make speeches or hold galas. Instead, he quietly funded ballet classes for kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and offered grants to women who were trying to rebuild their lives. He never put his name on anything. It wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure no child slipped through the cracks because someone believed they weren't worth the effort. One afternoon, just before the twins' spring recital, Garrett stood backstage holding a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked himself from the park. He wore jeans and a button-down shirt, not a suit, and there was a smudge of glitter on his wrist from helping Evie fix a last-minute costume issue. The auditorium was full. Parents, teachers, friends. He should have felt nervous. Instead, he felt steady. The girls were dancing to a piece called Home, choreographed by their teacher with them in mind. Garrett had watched them practice it dozens of times in the living room, the way they moved with quiet grace, like they knew the story their bodies were telling. When they stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. The music began, gentle, slow, and Garrett's breath caught. Emma and Evie moved like they were born for it, like the stage belonged to them, and as they danced, Garrett felt something in his chest shift. Not break, but open. After the final note, the audience erupted into applause. The girls took their bows, hand in hand, smiling in a way that could light up a city. Garrett stood clapping until his hands stung. When they found him after the performance, they didn't run. They walked up to him with all the confidence in the world, and Emma, grinning, asked, "Did we do okay?" Garrett knelt down, kissed the top of each of their heads, and said, "You were magic." That night, they had dinner at home, pizza and orange soda, the girls still in their costumes, glitter on the floor, laughter echoing through the house. After they fell asleep, curled into each other like they had since birth, Garrett sat in the hallway outside their room and watched them for a long time. There were no more questions in his mind. No more fear that he wasn't enough. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. He was theirs. And they were his. He passed by the photo of Maggie on the wall as he walked to the kitchen. She was smiling in that way she always had, mischievous and knowing, as if she had seen all of this coming. Next to her photo, the bracelet sat in its glass case, still shining under the soft hallway light. It was no longer a symbol of the past. It was a promise kept. Garrett poured a cup of tea, stepped out onto the porch, and let the quiet of the evening wrap around him. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He had already arrived. And in that stillness, with the sound of crickets in the distance and the memory of his daughter's laughter in the air, he finally understood what it meant to be whole. Not because he had built something great, but because he had stayed. Because he had chosen love when he could have walked away. And that, he knew, would always be the finest thing he'd ever done. To me, the ending of this story isn't about a perfect resolution, it's about the quiet power of transformation. Garrett didn't win back a fortune, or rebuild his empire, or return to the top of the business world. What he did was far more meaningful. He became a man who chose love over legacy, presence over power, and family over fear. Watching him go from emotionally distant and self-focused to someone who finds peace in bedtime routines and glitter-covered drawings feels like the kind of arc we don't see enough, subtle, honest, and deeply human. What I love most is that the story doesn't try to erase his flaws or pretend the journey was easy. He lost things, yes, but he found something real, a home, not made of walls and wealth, but of trust, forgiveness, and the willingness to stay. And that makes his quiet, porch-lit ending one of the most powerful kinds of happy there is, the kind you earn.